You know, adults have a tremendous amount of power over kids, and that's as it should be. Power also with kids is really important, and we need to use it in the right way if we want kids to be happy and healthy and to avoid misbehaviors. Hi, I'm Dr. Brett Pierce, child psychologist, and today I'm coming at you with a video on the subject of the use of personal power and position power with kids. But before we get into that, it is time, of course, for the 3 T's. So, T number 1 today is the drink, and I've just got, a boring, regular plain mug, but I'm drinking some straightforward but delicious English breakfast tea. It's really good. T number 2 is the toy, and I'm so nerding out over this toy right now. So this is the Mantis alien from a maker called NECA, and they're like my favorite new toy makers. It just came the other day. It's so cool, and I could spend the whole video nerding out over it. Hopefully when I set it down, it will stand and not fall down. Okay, it's standing. The third T is the talk for today, and the talk is on the use of power with kids. I think culturally, for the longest time, almost around the world from what I can tell, but I'd hate to say literally everywhere, we have had just this attitude that we should display a lot of position power over kids. Now, before I get into that, let me explain quickly the difference between personal power and position power. Starting with telling you that I go into this a lot more on the blog post, so you should check that out. We can try to put a link to my blog somewhere here-ish. So there are 2 different kinds of power. Neither one is right or wrong or sort of better or worse than the other. So there's position power and personal power. Position power in life is the power of the official. So as a psychologist, I guess, I have a lot of position power. I have the authority to make diagnoses. I have the authority to treat mental health disorders. My signature can do things like authorize certain kinds of treatments. Judges tend to have a lot of respect for psychologists and we can have a lot of influence on court situations, etc., etc., etc. Position power is not wrong. Police officers have a lot of position power. Politicians have a lot of position power. Professionals like doctors and lawyers and mental health professionals and things like that have a lot of position power. Parents have almost absolute position power over their kids in almost every single way that you can conceive. And I'm not saying that's wrong, by the way. We clearly don't want a 2-year-old, say, or even a 12-year-old running their own show. That's a problem for sure. Personal power, in contrast, is more of the power of trust, respect, influence. It's a lot more, instead of being kind of like from here, like position power, it's more from here. Personal power is the ability to influence by cultivating respect, by mentoring, by educating, by facilitating, by communicating, by helping someone address needs, etc. Personal power and position power both have their uses, and what's really interesting and challenging for parents is that both have a really complex and intense interplay with kids, because kids are utterly dependent on adults, particularly the younger they are. They're dependent on us for how to organize their feelings, how to understand life, a lot of things that are more about personal power, and they're utterly dependent on us from a position power standpoint. Kids can't even really own their own property, as I understand it, from a legal, premise, let alone have any other kinds of official sorts of power or rights. I mean, they have some, for sure. So let's jump into some specifics. So in general, when parents are struggling, it's because they're usually overly relying on position power. And I think a lot of this comes from that cultural piece that I mentioned earlier. It wasn't too long ago that it was absolutely considered not only acceptable, but necessary to beat kids, just as a matter of regularity, whether or not they even did anything wrong, really. And where does that come from? Well, I think it comes from just the spirit of needing to feel powerful that we've just had in our culture. There's just this way where we sort of feel like the way of relating with other people, including kids, is all about having power. Power's not wrong, per se. So let's talk about some specifics. So you probably are guessing, if you've been following my channel, that I'm talking a lot about the use of punishment, giving and taking away things, rewards, because rewards are fine, but even an over-reliance on giving things is a use of position power and can undermine your own personal power. When we use a lot of position power with kids, say because a kid is misbehaving, we tend to acknowledge that we don't really have personal power in the situation to influence the kid, to try to help the kid learn and grow, to try to help the kid come up with his or her own solutions, to try to help the child understand their own feelings and motives better, to try to help the kid see the long-term impact of unhelpful choices. Instead, we, in this almost urgent fashion, kind of use frustration and use it as a justification for overuse of position power. And what happens when we overly use position power? We tend to breed a lot of anger, fear, frustration, and resentment. Don't believe me? Well, think about what would happen if a police officer overused position power. In fact, it is actually illegal in many cases for police officers to overuse position power, and we have rights that protect people from that for a good reason. But let's get a little bit more down home here. So imagine you were pulled over for going over the speed limit a little bit, and instead of flashing the lights and then following you over, the police officer smashed your car with his and ran you off the road, coming out of the car with his weapon out, screaming and threatening you to comply with every little thing he says at gunpoint and with a lot of display of like strength and power. It would be hostile, terrifying, and clearly unhelpful, and it would breed hostility between citizens and the police. Police officers these days, from what I understand it, are very often trained in the use of personal power first and foremost, through goal-directed communication, through assertiveness, through active listening, etc. Because it is really, really important to avoid the overuse of position power. It just doesn't affect people well. And personally, if I were pulled over, a police officer who is clear, who is transparent, who is respectful, who is assertive, and is not just resorting to this chest-thumping display of position power, is going to get a lot more compliance and have a lot easier time with me. I don't know about you. So the same thing goes for kids. It does not have a good effect on kids to use a lot of threats, to use a lot of consequences, to use a lot of displays of power like that. It doesn't matter if we're using a nice tone of voice. It's still an overuse of position power. It works a lot better with kids to use personal power. And to use personal power with kids means to do things like express concern for their needs. What's really going on for you here? You know, you've had a hard time listening all day and it's not feeling good for you. It's really frustrating. Is something going on? This isn't working well. What can we do to make this work better for everyone? Tell me more about what's bothering you. Well, okay, you know, we could give that a try, I guess, but if it doesn't work, then we're going to have to talk about it some more. These things are not easy to do. They're really context dependent. It depends on the kid, depends on the situation. Behavior management in general with kids is very, very, very complicated. And the slightest little variable can make it so that you want to do something totally different. Sometimes with some kids, you want to do not much, because when kids are motivated a lot by attention, say, then doing much of anything to intervene can sometimes reinforce negative behavior. Whereas with another kid doing the same behaviors, you might want to really intervene a lot because that kid is not as motivated by attention, say. So I get it, it's really complicated. But what I can certainly promise you, as a practicing child psychologist who's seen, 4,000 or 5,000, 6,000 kids just directly, let alone consulted on a lot of other cases and things, is that I've never seen the use, particularly the overuse of position power, go well. It tends to inflict a lot of resentment, anger, and frustration, and Anger, resentment, and frustration, I think you'll agree, are not necessarily known for being connected with good behavior for anyone. So at any rate, thank you for listening. I know this is a fairly abstract video, but the challenging thing is that going into the specifics of it would really require a very long video, and maybe we should think about doing that here on the channel, trying to figure out a way of illustrating some really, really specific examples of how to use personal power with kids. Bottom line is, personal power, when emphasized, tends to be a lot more effective, particularly in the long run, at least in my experience. So thank you for listening. This is Dr. Brett Pierce, child psychologist, about to sign off. If you have not already, please do consider subscribing. It really does help out the channel. You can give me a thumbs up as well, and consider slapping that notification bell gizmo so that you can know when my next video goes live. Otherwise, this is Brett Pierce, child psychologist, signing off. Bye-bye.